Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing great. What would you do if the person you love the most asked you for a divorce again and again until it happened for the 100th time? Would you keep fighting for the relationship or would you finally walk away forever? Today, we're going to explain the complete story of the newly released Chinese short drama, The 100th Divorce Was Final. This emotional drama is packed with love, betrayal, heartbreaking misunderstandings, painful regrets, and an unforgettable journey of self-worth and second chances. In this video, I'll explain the entire story from beginning to end in simple and easy English, covering every major twist, emotional moment, and shocking revelation so you won't miss a single detail. So, without wasting any more time, let's get started with the complete story of the 100th Divorce Was Final. The city of Silverbrook never truly slept. Even long after midnight, the glowing lights from office towers reflected across the river, hiding countless stories behind their shining windows. Among those stories was the quiet life of a young woman named Clara Bennett, a woman who had once believed that love alone could fix every broken promise. 3 years earlier, she had married Adrian Carter, a talented businessman whose confidence and ambition attracted everyone around him. Clara had imagined a future filled with laughter, children, and peaceful evenings together, but reality slowly became something completely different. Adrian wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He never shouted in public or raised his hand against her. Instead, he mastered a quieter kind of pain. Whenever something didn't go his way, he reminded Clara that she was replaceable. Every disagreement ended with the same cold sentence: "Maybe we should end this marriage." At first, Clara thought he was speaking out of anger, so she apologized even when she had done nothing wrong. She believed patience was another form of love. Months passed, and the threats never stopped. Each time Adrian mentioned separation, Clara swallowed her pride, smiled through her tears, and tried even harder to become the perfect wife. She woke before sunrise to prepare breakfast, remembered every important meeting on his calendar, celebrated every business success, and quietly comforted him after every failure. Friends often admired their seemingly perfect marriage, but they never saw Clara crying alone in the kitchen after Adrian had gone to sleep. She hid her sadness behind warm smiles because she feared that admitting the truth would mean accepting that her dream marriage had never really existed. Unknown to almost everyone, Clara had once been one of the brightest architecture students in the country. Before marriage, she had won design competitions and dreamed of building beautiful public spaces where families could gather. She had even received an invitation to join an international design firm. However, Adrian had convinced her to reject the opportunity. He promised that once his own company became successful, they would travel the world together and she could return to architecture whenever she wished. Trusting his words, Clara gave up her career without hesitation. Years later, the rolled-up blueprints hidden inside an old wooden cabinet became silent reminders of the life she had sacrificed. One rainy afternoon, Clara visited her grandmother Eleanor, the woman who had raised her after her parents passed away. Eleanor lived in a small countryside cottage surrounded by colorful flowers that somehow bloomed even during gloomy weather. As soon as Clara stepped inside, her grandmother noticed the sadness hiding behind her smile. Instead of asking questions immediately, she simply poured 2 cups of hot tea and waited. After several minutes of silence, Clara finally whispered, "Do you think love should always hurt?" Eleanor looked at her gently before answering, "Real love asks you to grow, not disappear." Those simple words stayed in Clara's heart long after she returned home. Meanwhile, Adrian's company was growing rapidly. Investors admired his confidence, and magazines praised him as one of the city's fastest-rising entrepreneurs. Success slowly changed him. He became more obsessed with appearances than relationships. Every dinner became a networking opportunity. Every weekend turned into another business event. Clara accompanied him everywhere, wearing elegant dresses and offering polite smiles while Adrian introduced her simply as "my wife," never mentioning the dreams she had abandoned for him. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple. Inside their luxurious apartment, however, silence had become louder than conversation. One evening, Adrian hosted an important celebration after securing a major investment. The apartment filled with influential guests, expensive music, and endless compliments. Clara spent the entire day preparing the event, making sure every detail was perfect. As the night progressed, one investor praised the beautiful decorations and asked Adrian whether his wife had designed the layout herself. Instead of appreciating her effort, Adrian laughed lightly and replied, "She has plenty of free time. I suppose she needed something to keep herself busy." Several guests laughed politely. Clara forced herself to smile, but inside she felt a small part of her confidence crumble. Nobody noticed the quiet disappointment in her eyes. Later that night, after the guests had left, Clara gently told Adrian that his comment had embarrassed her. She wasn't angry. She simply wanted him to understand how much his words had hurt. Adrian barely looked up from his phone before saying, "You're too sensitive. If you can't handle a joke, maybe you shouldn't come to these events." Clara tried explaining that respect mattered more than expensive gifts or luxury apartments. Adrian sighed impatiently and muttered, "Sometimes I wonder if marrying you was a mistake." The sentence echoed through the empty apartment like a door quietly closing forever. For the first time in years, Clara didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply walked onto the balcony, watching the city lights shimmer beneath the rain. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice asked a question she had avoided for years. When did I stop being myself? She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed without pretending. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her dreams. She had spent so long protecting the marriage that she had forgotten to protect the person inside it. The following morning, Clara opened the old cabinet containing her university sketches. Dust covered the folders, but the designs still reflected the creativity she once possessed. She spent hours looking through them, remembering late nights at college, ambitious conversations with classmates, and the excitement of imagining buildings that could change people's lives. For the first time in years, she smiled, not because someone else expected her to, but because she remembered the woman she used to be. A few days later, while buying coffee near the city library, Clara unexpectedly met Ethan Hayes, an old university friend. Ethan immediately recognized her despite the passing years. They talked for nearly an hour about architecture, their classmates, and the dreams they once shared. Ethan had become the founder of a respected architectural design studio that specialized in community projects. Before leaving, he handed Clara his business card and said warmly, "Talent doesn't disappear just because life takes a different path. If you ever want to design again, my door is always open." Clara slipped the card into her purse without making any promises. Yet during the journey home, she found herself reading it over and over again. It wasn't simply a job offer. It was the first reminder that someone still believed in her abilities. That evening, Adrian returned home late, barely acknowledging her presence before disappearing into his office. Clara watched the closed door for several seconds before quietly placing Ethan's business card beside her old blueprints. Outside, another storm rolled across the city, but this time Clara didn't feel afraid of the thunder. Deep inside her heart, something much stronger had begun to awaken. She still loved her husband, but for the first time she realized that loving someone else should never require abandoning herself. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know whether her marriage could survive or whether her forgotten dreams could become reality again. All she knew was that the next decision she made would not be based on fear. It would be based on hope, and that single choice was about to change not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The following Monday arrived with an unusual sense of calm. Clara woke before sunrise as she always did, prepared breakfast, ironed Adrian's suit, and placed a cup of freshly brewed coffee on the dining table. Yet something had changed inside her. She no longer rushed around the apartment hoping to earn a smile or a word of appreciation. Instead, she moved quietly, almost peacefully, as though she had finally accepted that another person's happiness could never depend entirely on her sacrifices. Adrian noticed the difference immediately. Usually, Clara would remind him about his meetings, ask whether he needed anything, and walk him to the door. That morning, she simply wished him a good day and returned to reading a book she had borrowed from the city library. Adrian looked at her with slight confusion before leaving, but he dismissed the feeling. He assumed she would return to her usual self within a day or two. After the apartment became silent, Clara picked up Ethan's business card once again. She stared at it for several minutes before finally gathering enough courage to make the call. Ethan answered almost instantly, sounding genuinely happy to hear her voice. They spoke about old memories, university projects, and the years that had passed since graduation. Before ending the conversation, Ethan invited her to visit his design studio that afternoon. "No pressure," he said warmly. "Just come and see the place. Sometimes seeing an old dream again reminds you why you fell in love with it." Clara hesitated for a moment before agreeing. The studio was unlike the cold corporate offices she had grown used to seeing with Adrian. Large windows filled the rooms with natural sunlight. Sketches, scale models, and colorful design boards covered the walls. Young architects discussed ideas enthusiastically while soft music played in the background. Instead of expensive furniture meant to impress clients, the office felt alive with creativity. Ethan welcomed Clara with a sincere smile and introduced her to the team. Nobody asked why she had disappeared from architecture for so many years. Instead, they were genuinely interested in hearing about the ideas she once dreamed of building. One of the designers noticed Clara examining a community park blueprint and casually asked for her opinion. Without realizing it, Clara began suggesting small improvements. She explained how changing the walking paths would create better access for elderly visitors and how additional trees could naturally cool the playground during summer. The team listened carefully. Ethan smiled quietly from across the room because he could see the confidence slowly returning to her voice. For the first time in years, Clara wasn't introducing herself as someone's wife. She was simply herself. Before she left, Ethan handed her a folder containing a small freelance project. It wasn't a permanent job or a huge responsibility. It was simply a proposal for redesigning a neglected neighborhood garden. "Work on it only if you enjoy it," he said. "There are no deadlines. I just think someone with your imagination could make this place beautiful." Clara accepted the folder with both excitement and nervousness. During the drive home, she couldn't stop opening it and studying the drawings. That evening, Adrian arrived home earlier than usual. As he walked into the living room, he found Clara completely focused on her sketches. Several sheets of paper were spread across the coffee table. Colored pencils, rulers, and notebooks surrounded her as though the room had become a small design studio. Adrian frowned. "What are you doing?" he asked. Clara looked up and smiled politely. "Just working on a design project." He raised an eyebrow. "Since when?" "Since today." Adrian laughed softly, not because he found it funny, but because he couldn't imagine Clara doing anything outside the home. "You're serious?" "Yes." He shrugged carelessly before walking toward the kitchen. "As long as it doesn't interfere with taking care of the house." The words stung, but they didn't crush her the way they once would have. Clara simply nodded and returned to her drawings. She realized something important. Adrian hadn't asked whether she was happy. He hadn't asked whether she had missed architecture. He only cared whether it would affect his routine. Over the next few weeks, Clara spent every spare moment working on the project. She visited the neighborhood garden, spoke with local families, watched children playing in broken playgrounds, and listened to elderly residents describe what the space meant to them. She designed wider walking paths, peaceful reading corners, flower gardens, and shaded picnic areas. The project wasn't just about landscaping anymore. It became a reminder that beautiful places could help people heal. Meanwhile, Adrian's business continued expanding rapidly. New investors, larger contracts, and constant media attention kept him busy. Success fed his confidence until it slowly turned into arrogance. He began believing that money could solve every problem. Whenever Clara wasn't immediately available to answer his calls, he became irritated. One evening, he complained that dinner wasn't ready on time because she had stayed late discussing ideas with Ethan's team. "You've changed," Adrian said coldly. Clara remained calm. "Maybe I'm just remembering who I used to be." He stared at her for several seconds before shaking his head. "You're overthinking things." She didn't argue. Several days later, Ethan invited Clara to present her garden proposal to a local development committee. She had never spoken before such an important audience since graduating from university. The night before the presentation, anxiety kept her awake. She worried that after so many years away from architecture, she would embarrass herself. The next morning, Ethan met her outside the conference hall. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little." He smiled. "Good. It means this matters to you." His encouragement gave Clara enough confidence to step inside. The presentation exceeded everyone's expectations. Clara explained not only the technical aspects of the design, but also the emotional purpose behind every decision. She described how parks could bring lonely people together, encourage children to play safely, and create stronger communities. By the end of her presentation, the committee members applauded warmly. A week later, Ethan called with exciting news. "We got the project." Clara covered her mouth in disbelief. "They loved your ideas," Ethan continued, "and they specifically requested that you stay involved throughout the entire project." For a brief moment, Clara couldn't speak. After years of believing her dreams had disappeared forever, someone had finally recognized her talent again. She celebrated quietly by visiting her grandmother Eleanor. When Clara shared the news, Eleanor hugged her tightly. "I always knew the world would find its way back to you," she whispered. Tears filled Clara's eyes. "For the first time in years," Clara admitted, "I feel like I'm breathing again." Back in the city, however, Adrian remained completely unaware of the transformation happening inside his wife. He noticed that she smiled more often and spent less time waiting for him, but instead of appreciating her growing confidence, he viewed it as a challenge to his authority. He had grown so accustomed to Clara revolving around his life that he couldn't understand why she suddenly seemed independent. One evening, Adrian attended a business gala where several executives praised Ethan Hayes and his successful architecture firm for winning an important community contract. Curious, Adrian asked which project they were referring to. One executive replied, "The lead designer was incredible. I believe her name was Clara Bennett." Adrian froze for a split second. "My wife?" he asked without thinking. The executive smiled. "Really? Then you must be incredibly proud of her." Everyone loved her presentation. Adrian forced a polite smile, but inside him something unfamiliar began to grow. It wasn't pride. It wasn't happiness. It was jealousy. For the very first time, he realized that Clara was beginning to build a life that no longer depended on him. As he drove home that night through the glowing city streets, Adrian couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. He had always assumed Clara would remain exactly where he left her, waiting patiently for his attention. He never imagined she might learn to shine on her own. And without realizing it, the balance of their marriage had quietly begun to change forever. The morning after the business gala, the city seemed no different than it had the day before. Cars filled the streets, office buildings reflected the rising sun, and thousands of people hurried toward another busy workday. Yet for Adrian Carter, everything suddenly felt unfamiliar. During breakfast, he watched Clara preparing tea while quietly reviewing a set of architectural sketches beside her plate. She looked calm, focused, and strangely confident. It was the same woman he had lived with for 3 years, yet somehow she seemed like someone he had never truly known. "You've been busy lately," Adrian finally said, trying to sound casual. Clara looked up from her notebook and smiled politely. "Yes, the garden project is moving faster than we expected. I heard people talking about it yesterday." She nodded. "They said your presentation impressed everyone." "That's kind of them." Adrian expected her to continue talking, perhaps asking how his own business meeting had gone, but she simply returned to her drawings. The silence made him uncomfortable. For years, Clara had always searched for topics to keep conversations alive. Now she no longer felt responsible for filling every quiet moment. As Adrian drove to his office, he couldn't stop thinking about the executive's words from the previous night. "You must be incredibly proud of her." The sentence echoed repeatedly in his mind. Why hadn't he known about the presentation? Why hadn't Clara told him? Or had she stopped expecting him to care? Across the city, Clara spent the morning visiting the construction site where the community garden would soon begin taking shape. Children played football on an empty dirt field while elderly neighbors sat on broken wooden benches beneath the few remaining trees. Many residents recognized her from the presentation and warmly thanked her for bringing new life to the forgotten neighborhood. An elderly man named Mr. Howard slowly approached her. "My wife loved flowers," he said quietly. "She passed away 3 years ago, but every Sunday I still come here because this was our favorite place. Thank you for giving people like me something to look forward to again." His words touched Clara deeply. For the first time, she realized architecture wasn't just about buildings or beautiful designs. It was about creating places where people could make memories. That afternoon, Ethan introduced Clara to another important client, a retired teacher named Margaret Lawson, who hoped to transform an abandoned library into a free learning center for children. "The city says renovating it isn't worth the cost," Margaret explained. "But I believe every child deserves a place where dreams can begin." Clara walked through the old building. Dust covered the shelves, Broken windows allowed sunlight to spill across the wooden floor, and years of neglect had nearly destroyed the structure. Most people saw an abandoned building. Clara saw possibility. "I'd like to help," she said. Margaret smiled with tears in her eyes. "I knew you'd understand." Meanwhile, Adrian faced unexpected trouble inside Carter Holdings. His financial director entered the conference room carrying several reports. "We have a problem." Adrian frowned. "What kind of problem?" "A major investor has postponed funding until next quarter." "That's temporary." "I'm afraid it isn't." The director placed another document on the table. "Two additional investors are considering withdrawing as well." Adrian remained silent. For the first time in years, success no longer felt guaranteed. Instead of focusing on solutions, however, his thoughts wandered back to Clara. She had somehow found confidence while his own world had begun showing cracks. A few evenings later, Clara returned home carrying several rolls of architectural drawings. As she unlocked the apartment door, she noticed every light inside had been turned off. The apartment was unusually quiet. Adrian sat alone in the living room staring at the city skyline through the large glass windows. "You came home late," he said. "I was meeting with a new client." "You've been doing that a lot." "The projects are growing." Adrian nodded without looking at her. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked, "Are you happy?" The question surprised Clara. She thought carefully before answering. "I'm happier than I was 6 months ago." It wasn't meant to hurt him. It was simply the truth. Adrian lowered his eyes. Somehow those words carried more weight than any argument they had ever shared. Days later, Ethan announced exciting news during the weekly design meeting. The city has launched a national architecture competition. The room immediately filled with excitement. Winning the competition would bring recognition across the country. Ethan looked toward Clara. "I think you should lead our team." Everyone agreed immediately. Clara hesitated. "I haven't even returned to architecture for a full year." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "And look how much you've already accomplished." After thinking quietly for several moments, Clara accepted. She knew the challenge would be difficult, but for the first time in years, difficult no longer frightened her. News of the competition spread quickly throughout the business community. During a networking dinner, Adrian overheard another conversation praising Clara's recent work. One businessman laughed. "Your wife might become more famous than you." Although the comment was intended as a joke, Adrian didn't laugh. Instead, he left the event earlier than planned. Driving alone through the city streets, he suddenly remembered something from years earlier. During university, Clara had once shown him a notebook filled with sketches of libraries, parks, museums, and schools. She had looked at him with bright, hopeful eyes. "One day," she had said, "I want to build places that make people smile." Back then he had smiled and promised to support every dream she had. When had that promise disappeared? He honestly couldn't remember. The following weekend, Clara visited her grandmother Eleanor again. The old woman listened patiently as Clara described the architecture competition. When Clara finished speaking, Eleanor walked toward an old wooden chest hidden beneath the staircase. Inside lay dozens of carefully preserved notebooks. "They belonged to your mother," Eleanor explained. "She wanted you to have them when the time was right." Clara carefully opened the first notebook. Inside were hand-drawn buildings, handwritten notes, and inspirational quotes. On the very last page, one sentence had been written in elegant handwriting. "Never build something only to impress people. Build something that improves their lives." Tears quietly filled Clara's eyes. It felt as though her mother had somehow reached across time to encourage her. From that day forward, Clara decided her competition design would honor that message. She wasn't creating a project to win awards. She wanted to create something that genuinely mattered. Late that evening, while organizing old documents in the apartment, Adrian accidentally discovered a dusty storage box hidden inside the hallway closet. Curious, he opened it. Inside were dozens of rolled architectural drawings. Alongside them sat several unopened envelopes. Each envelope carried the logo of prestigious international design firms. Every one of them had been addressed to Clara years earlier. Some offered interviews. Others offered scholarships. One even offered a position overseas. None had ever been opened. Adrian slowly sat down on the floor. His hands began trembling. He suddenly realized the terrible truth. Clara hadn't failed to chase her dreams. She had quietly given them up, because she had chosen him instead. And for the first time since their marriage began, Adrian understood that the greatest thing Clara had sacrificed was never her career. It was the future she had once imagined for herself. Holding those unopened letters in his hands, he felt a deep sense of regret settle over him. But outside the apartment window, the city lights continued shining as always. Completely unaware that two lives were now moving toward a future neither of them had ever expected. The unopened letters stayed on Adrian's desk long after midnight. He read each one carefully, noticing the dates printed in the corners. Some were 3 years old. Others were even older. Every letter described an opportunity that most young architects could only dream about. There were invitations to international workshops, scholarships, design competitions, and interviews with respected firms. Adrian leaned back in his chair, trying to remember those years. He vaguely recalled Clara mentioning a few emails from architecture companies before their wedding. But he had been so focused on expanding his own business that he had simply told her, "There will always be another opportunity." At the time, she had smiled and agreed without hesitation. He had never realized that those opportunities would never come again. The next morning, Adrian carefully placed the letters back inside the box exactly as he had found them. For the first time in years, he felt embarrassed whenever he looked at Clara. She entered the kitchen wearing a light blue blouse and carrying a notebook filled with sketches. Her expression looked peaceful. She greeted him with a polite smile before making breakfast. Adrian wanted to apologize for everything, but every sentence sounded too small compared to the years she had sacrificed. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you have another meeting today?" Clara nodded. "Yes. We're visiting several schools for the Learning Center project." "Sounds important." "It is." She finished her coffee, picked up her bag, and quietly left the apartment. As the door closed behind her, Adrian realized something painful. They still lived in the same home, yet their conversations had become those of polite strangers rather than husband and wife. Meanwhile, Clara met Ethan and the design team outside the abandoned library. Margaret Lawson had invited teachers, parents, and neighborhood children to share their ideas for the renovation. Instead of presenting finished designs immediately, Clara spent hours listening. One little girl wished for a reading corner with colorful cushions. An elderly teacher wanted a quiet history room filled with local photographs. Teenagers asked for computer spaces where they could study after school. Clara wrote down every suggestion. When Ethan noticed her filling page after page with notes, he smiled. "You always listen before you design." Clara looked at the excited children running through the old building. "Buildings are for people," she replied. "If we don't understand their lives, we'll never build the right place." Ethan admired her approach. Unlike many architects who focused only on appearance, Clara cared about how people would actually live inside the spaces she created. A few days later, construction officially began on the community garden. Residents volunteered to plant flowers, paint benches, and clean walking paths. Clara worked alongside them wearing simple clothes instead of expensive business outfits. She laughed with children, helped elderly volunteers carry supplies, and spent hours planting trees beneath the warm afternoon sun. A local journalist happened to pass by while covering another event nearby. Curious about the unusual community project, she interviewed several residents. One elderly woman smiled proudly and pointed toward Clara. "That young lady didn't just design this garden. She gave our neighborhood hope again." The interview aired on local television that evening. Back at Carter Holdings, several employees watched the short news segment during lunch. "Isn't that Mr. Carter's wife?" one employee asked. Another nodded. "I had no idea she was such a talented architect." The conversation spread quickly throughout the office. When Adrian stepped out of a meeting, he noticed everyone suddenly becoming quiet. His assistant hesitated before showing him the news report on her phone. For several moments, Adrian watched Clara smiling naturally while children surrounded her. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her smile like that at home. That evening, he arrived home carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Clara had always loved lilies because her mother used to grow them in their garden. She looked surprised. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "No occasion," Adrian answered awkwardly. "I just thought you might like them." Clara accepted the flowers politely. "Thank you." She placed them in a glass vase before returning to her desk to continue working. Adrian stood silently in the living room. Years earlier, flowers would have made Clara incredibly happy. Now they simply became another decoration in the apartment. He slowly began understanding that repairing a relationship required far more than kind gestures. Several weeks passed, and the National Architecture Competition entered its final stage. Hundreds of teams submitted proposals from across the country. Clara and Ethan's studio spent countless late nights perfecting every detail. Their project focused on transforming abandoned urban spaces into educational community centers powered by renewable energy. Unlike many competitors who emphasized luxury and impressive appearances, Clara's design centered around accessibility, sustainability, and bringing communities together. The judges announced that only 5 teams would advance to the final presentation. When the results were published, Ethan gathered everyone inside the studio. Nobody spoke while refreshing the competition website. Suddenly, one designer jumped from his chair. "We made it!" The office exploded with celebration. Clara stared silently at the screen. Their studio's name appeared among the 5 finalists. She covered her face with both hands, overwhelmed with emotion. Years ago, she had believed her career was over forever. Now she stood only one step away from the biggest achievement of her professional life. That evening, Ethan organized a small celebration dinner for the entire team at a cozy family-owned restaurant. Halfway through the meal, he stood up holding a glass of sparkling juice. "I'd like to make a toast," he said. Everyone became quiet. This studio has completed many successful projects over the years, but this one is special, not because of the competition, but because it reminded all of us why we became architects in the first place. He turned toward Clara. "Thank you for inspiring every one of us." The team applauded warmly. Clara smiled, slightly embarrassed. She wasn't used to receiving recognition. At the same time, Adrian sat alone inside his luxury apartment. He had prepared dinner himself, hoping Clara would arrive early. Instead, he received a short message. "Celebrating with the team. I'll be home later. Don't wait for me." He stared at the phone for a long time. The apartment felt strangely empty despite its expensive furniture and beautiful city view. For years, Clara had waited for him during countless late nights. Now their roles had quietly reversed. Near midnight, Adrian stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city. Across the street, he noticed an old couple sitting on a park bench. The elderly man carefully wrapped his jacket around his wife's shoulders before they slowly walked home together, laughing about something only they understood. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but somehow it touched Adrian more deeply than any business success he had ever celebrated. For the first time, he questioned everything he had spent years chasing. Money had built him a successful company, but it had not taught him how to protect the person who loved him most. Inside the apartment, the white lilies Clara had placed in the vase quietly began to bloom. Adrian looked at them for several seconds before whispering to himself, "I spent years trying to build an empire, and never realized I was letting my home fall apart." Little did he know, the biggest challenge of his life was no longer waiting inside a boardroom. It was waiting in the heart of the woman who had finally learned to live for herself. Autumn arrived quietly in Silverbrook, painting the streets with shades of gold and amber. Every morning, fallen leaves covered the sidewalks, and a cool breeze swept through the city. For Clara, the changing season felt symbolic. Only a few months earlier, she had believed her life would remain the same forever. Now, every new sunrise seemed to bring another opportunity. She spent most of her days balancing the community library project, the national architecture competition, and the neighborhood garden that had already become a favorite gathering place for local families. Watching children laugh beneath the trees she had helped plant gave her a sense of fulfillment that no luxury apartment or expensive gift had ever provided. One Saturday morning, Clara visited the garden before meeting Ethan at the studio. As she walked along the newly built paths, she noticed a group of volunteers setting up tables for the garden's first community festival. Families were hanging colorful decorations, teenagers were arranging music equipment, and local artists were displaying handmade paintings. It was exactly the kind of place she had dreamed of creating when she was a university student. An elderly woman recognized Clara and hurried over with a warm smile. "You're the architect, aren't you?" Clara smiled shyly. "I helped with the design." The woman gently shook her head. "No," she replied. "You helped rebuild this neighborhood." Those words stayed with Clara for the rest of the day. She had spent years believing success meant recognition or awards, but now she understood that changing even one person's life could be a far greater achievement. Meanwhile, Adrian's problems continued to grow. Carter Holdings had lost another important investor, forcing several large projects to be postponed. During a tense board meeting, directors questioned his recent decisions and demanded a new strategy. Adrian answered confidently, but inside he felt exhausted. For the first time since starting the company, he admitted to himself that he had spent so many years chasing endless growth that he had forgotten why he had started the business in the first place. After the meeting ended, Adrian's longtime assistant, Michael, approached him carefully. "Sir," he said, "may I ask you something?" Adrian looked up. "You've built one of the most successful companies in the city." Michael hesitated before continuing. "But are you actually happy?" The unexpected question caught Adrian completely off guard. He didn't answer, because, for the first time in years, he honestly didn't know. That evening, Clara and Ethan attended the city's annual Community Innovation Forum, where architects, engineers, educators, and nonprofit organizations shared ideas for improving public spaces. Their Learning Center proposal had attracted attention from several charitable foundations interested in funding educational projects. During one presentation, Clara met Daniel Brooks, a retired civil engineer who had spent 40 years designing schools across rural communities. Daniel had recently established a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping young professionals create affordable public projects. After reviewing Clara's designs, Daniel smiled. "You don't draw buildings," he said. "You draw hope." Clara laughed softly. "I've never heard anyone describe architecture like that." Daniel folded the blueprints carefully. "That's because too many people build for profit. You build for people." Before leaving, Daniel handed her his card. "If you ever decide to start your own design foundation, call me." Clara looked at the card thoughtfully. The idea had never crossed her mind. Yet somehow, it didn't seem impossible anymore. A few days later, exciting news arrived. The National Competition Committee invited all 5 finalists to present their projects during a televised public exhibition. Instead of choosing a winner behind closed doors, the judges wanted communities across the country to see how each design could improve everyday life. The announcement filled Ethan's studio with nervous excitement. Everyone immediately began preparing models, presentations, animations, and detailed reports. Clara, however, focused on something different. She spent several evenings interviewing children, teachers, elderly residents, and volunteers who had participated in the garden project. When Ethan asked why, she smiled. "Buildings are only half the story. The people are the other half." At home, Adrian noticed another change. Clara no longer spent every evening waiting for him. Sometimes she worked late at the studio. Sometimes she visited construction sites. Sometimes she simply met her grandmother for dinner. Her life no longer revolved around his schedule. One rainy evening, Adrian stood in the kitchen preparing tea when Clara returned home. She looked tired but genuinely happy. "I saw the news," Adrian said quietly. "What news?" "Your team made the final exhibition." Clara nodded. "We're still working." "I'm proud of you." The words came naturally. For a brief moment, Clara looked surprised. Then she smiled politely. "Thank you." She meant it. But the conversation ended there. Adrian suddenly realized something painful. Compliments that should have been spoken years ago had arrived far too late. The following weekend, the Community Garden Festival officially opened. Hundreds of residents attended. Children painted murals. Local musicians performed. Food stalls lined the walking paths. The once-forgotten neighborhood had transformed into one of the city's happiest places. The mayor personally visited the event to thank everyone involved. While touring the garden, he stopped beside Clara. "I've received requests from 3 neighboring districts asking for similar community spaces." He smiled warmly. "I think your work has started something much bigger." News reporters captured the moment. By evening, photos of the festival spread across newspapers and social media. Many articles praised not only the project itself, but also the young architect who believed communities should help shape their own neighborhoods. Late that night, Adrian quietly searched Clara's name online. Page after page of interviews, photographs, and community stories appeared on his screen. One article included a short quote from Clara. "Success isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by how many lives become a little brighter because you cared enough to help." Adrian read the sentence several times. It reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with years earlier. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that her greatest strength had never been ambition. It had always been kindness. The next morning, Adrian made an unexpected decision. Instead of driving directly to the office, he visited the community garden before sunrise. The park was quiet. Birds sang softly among the trees. A few elderly residents practiced morning exercises while children chased pigeons across the open square. No one recognized him. He slowly walked through every path Clara had designed. Near the entrance stood a small bronze plaque. It didn't mention Clara's achievements. Instead, it simply read, "Dedicated to every neighbor who believe that working together can create something beautiful." Adrian smiled sadly. He finally understood why Clara had become so passionate about these projects. She wasn't searching for fame. She was creating places where people could belong. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a little boy carefully watering flowers beside one of the benches. "Why are you here so early?" Adrian asked. The boy smiled brightly. "My grandma says if you take care of beautiful things, they stay beautiful." The innocent answer struck Adrian more deeply than the child could possibly know. Driving away from the garden, Adrian stared silently at the road ahead. For years he had expected love, trust, and marriage to survive on their own. He had never realized they also needed care. Just like flowers, just like gardens, just like every beautiful thing in life. And for the first time, he wondered whether he had already waited too long to save what truly mattered. Winter arrived earlier than expected, covering Silverbrook in a thin layer of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun. The streets were quieter now, and people hurried through the cold with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks. Inside Ethan's architecture studio, however, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Every desk was covered with sketches, computer models, handwritten notes, and coffee cups. The National Design Exhibition was only 3 weeks away, and everyone worked tirelessly to perfect their presentation. Clara stood in front of a large model of the Learning Center, carefully adjusting the tiny trees surrounding the building. She stepped back and studied every detail. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was close. More importantly, it represented everything she believed architecture should be. A place where children could learn, families could gather, and communities could grow stronger together. Ethan walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've been here since 6 this morning." Clara accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "I couldn't stop thinking about the entrance." He laughed. "I had a feeling you'd say that." They spent the next hour discussing small improvements, not because the judges would necessarily notice them, but because they believed every detail mattered. Across town, Adrian was facing a very different kind of challenge. Carter Holdings had entered its most difficult financial quarter since the company was founded. Several expensive developments had been delayed, while competitors aggressively pursued his remaining clients. During another board meeting, directors suggested reducing staff and canceling community sponsorship programs to save money. Adrian listened quietly before speaking. "No." The room fell silent. One director frowned. "Those sponsorships don't generate profit." "I know. Then why keep them?" Adrian paused. "Because businesses don't only exist to make money." The directors exchanged confused glances. It was the first time anyone had heard Adrian say something like that. After the meeting ended, Michael smiled quietly. "You've changed." Adrian looked out the office window. "I'm trying to." That weekend, Clara received an unexpected phone call from Daniel Brooks. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. I've been thinking about your work." "So have I," Clara replied with a laugh. Daniel continued. "Our foundation recently purchased an abandoned warehouse on the east side of the city." "What for?" "We want to transform it into a creative center for teenagers." Clara remained silent. "We'd like you to become the lead architect." She almost dropped the phone. "I don't know if I'm ready." Daniel smiled. The best people rarely believe they're ready. He invited her to visit the site the following morning. The warehouse stood beside an old railway line that had been in use for years. Broken windows covered the building. Graffiti painted every wall. Most investors considered the property worthless. Daniel handed Clara an old blueprint. "What do you see?" She slowly walked through the empty building. High ceilings, strong steel beams, wide open spaces, sunlight pouring through shattered windows. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I see music rooms." Daniel smiled. She continued. "Art studios." She walked farther. A robotics workshop. Another step. A theater. Finally, she reached the center of the building, and a place where teenagers can believe in themselves. Daniel nodded proudly. I knew you'd understand. Meanwhile, Ethan's studio finalized preparations for the national exhibition. Journalists, investors, architects, and government officials from across the country would attend. Winning wasn't guaranteed, but simply reaching the final had already transformed the reputation of the studio. The evening before the exhibition, Ethan gathered everyone together. No matter what happens tomorrow, remember something. Everyone looked toward him. We're not competing against other architects. We're competing against the idea that beautiful public spaces are impossible. The team applauded. Clara smiled. She had never worked in an environment where people celebrated purpose more than profit. The exhibition hall opened the following morning. Thousands of visitors filled the enormous convention center. Every finalist displayed massive architectural models, digital presentations, and interactive exhibits. Some focused on futuristic skyscrapers. Others showcased luxury developments. Clara's team's presentation looked surprisingly simple. Children's drawings decorated one wall. Community photographs covered another. Visitors could sit inside a small reading corner designed exactly like the Future Learning Center. People immediately gathered around. Instead of asking technical questions, families began sharing stories. Teachers discussed education. Parents suggested new ideas. Children excitedly pointed toward colorful models. Clara spent hours talking with complete strangers. By afternoon, their exhibit had become one of the busiest in the entire hall. Unexpectedly, Adrian arrived at the exhibition. He hadn't planned to attend. Curiosity had simply led him there. Standing quietly in the crowd, he watched Clara confidently explain her designs to visitors. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply spoke with genuine passion. For several minutes, Adrian remained unnoticed. Then Ethan walked over. "You came?" Adrian nodded. "I wanted to see her work." Ethan smiled politely. "You should be proud." "I am." The answer surprised even Adrian himself. There was no jealousy anymore, only admiration. That evening, the judges announced the final results. The enormous hall became completely silent. Third place, another team. Second place, a prestigious international firm. Only two names remained. The chief judge stepped toward the microphone. This year's winning project was selected not only for its technical excellence, but because it reminded us that architecture begins with people. Clara held her breath. The National Community Design Award goes to Hayes Community Studio. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then the entire team erupted with excitement. Applause echoed throughout the hall. Some designers hugged each other. Others laughed. Several cried openly. Clara stood frozen. She couldn't believe it. Ethan gently placed the winner's certificate into her hands. "You earned this." Tears rolled down her cheeks. Not because she had won, but because years earlier she had believed she would never design anything again. Later that night, while everyone celebrated, Clara quietly stepped outside the convention center. Snowflakes drifted gently through the cold air. The city lights reflected beautifully against the white streets. She looked up at the night sky and whispered softly, "I hope you're proud of me, Mom." Behind her, Adrian had followed without making a sound. He stopped several steps away. "I think she would be." Clara turned slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian smiled. "Congratulations." "Thank you. You've accomplished something incredible." She looked at the glowing city skyline. "It wasn't just me." "No," Adrian replied quietly. "But you were brave enough to start again." Those words carried a sincerity Clara had never heard from him before. She nodded gently. "I finally remembered who I wanted to become." Adrian smiled sadly. "And I finally realized who you always were." The snow continued falling between them. Neither knew what the future would hold. But for the first time in many years, they were speaking honestly. Not as opponents, not as strangers, but simply as two people who had both changed in ways neither had expected. And although the distance between them still remained, something important had happened that cold winter night. Not the beginning of a romance. Not the end of regret, but the beginning of understanding. The morning after the National Design Exhibition, Silverbrook woke to headlines celebrating the winning community project. Newspapers featured photographs of children exploring the Model Learning Center, while local television stations interviewed architects from Ethan's studio about their vision for creating spaces that served ordinary people. Clara's name appeared in nearly every article, yet she paid little attention to the media attention. Instead of reading interviews about herself, She spent the morning answering emails from schools, nonprofit organizations, and neighborhood groups that wanted help transforming forgotten spaces into places filled with life. When Ethan arrived at the studio, he found Clara sitting at her desk surrounded by stacks of letters. "I hope you're not planning to answer every one of these today," he joked. Clara smiled. "They took the time to write. The least I can do is read them." Ethan picked up one of the envelopes. It contained a handwritten letter from a 12-year-old boy named Oliver. "Dear Ms. Bennett, I visited your exhibition with my school. Before yesterday, I thought architects only built expensive buildings for rich people. Now I want to become an architect because I want to help my neighborhood too. Thank you for showing me that dreams can help other people." Ethan quietly folded the letter. "I think this means more than the trophy." Clara nodded. "It definitely does." Meanwhile, Carter Holdings continued facing difficult decisions. Although Adrian had prevented major layoffs, the company's financial recovery was moving slowly. Several directors pushed him to abandon smaller community contracts and focus only on projects that generated higher profits. During another board meeting, Adrian surprised everyone. "I've made a decision." The room became silent. "From now on, every major project we develop will include public community spaces." One director frowned. "That's expensive." Adrian looked directly at him. "So is rebuilding trust after people lose it." The directors exchanged uncertain glances. Some disagreed. Others remained thoughtful. For the first time, Adrian wasn't making decisions based only on numbers. He was thinking about people. A few days later, Daniel Brooks invited Clara to visit another town nearly 2 hours outside Silverbrook. The small community had once depended on a large textile factory, but after it closed several years earlier, many families moved away. Empty shops lined the streets, and the town square had become unusually quiet. As Clara walked through the area, she noticed something different from the city. People still smiled at one another. Neighbors greeted strangers. Children rode bicycles together without worrying about traffic. Despite the economic struggles, the town hadn't lost its sense of community. Daniel stopped in front of an abandoned train station. "We're thinking about turning this into a cultural center." Clara slowly stepped inside. Old wooden benches remained untouched. Large windows overlooked the valley. Sunlight streamed across the worn stone floor. She closed her eyes. Instead of imagining what the building had been, she imagined what it could become. An art gallery, a music school, a small cafe run by local families, a theater for community performances. She smiled. "I already have ideas." Daniel laughed. "I knew you would." That evening, while driving back to Silverbrook, Clara received an unexpected phone call from her grandmother. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" Her grandmother hesitated. "I didn't want to worry you." Clara immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" "I slipped while watering the garden." Clara's heart raced. "Are you hurt?" "Just my ankle." "I'm coming." Without another word, Clara turned the car around. When she arrived at the cottage, she found Eleanor sitting comfortably with her foot resting on a pillow. The injury wasn't serious, but the doctor recommended several weeks of rest. Clara stayed the night to help around the house. The following morning, while organizing old family photographs, she discovered a small wooden box hidden inside a cabinet. Inside were dozens of faded pictures of her parents. One photograph immediately caught her attention. Her mother stood beside a half-finished children's library, smiling proudly while holding rolled architectural plans. Clara looked closer. The building looked strangely familiar. "Eleanor." Her grandmother smiled gently. "Your mother designed the first children's library in this county." Clara stared silently at the picture. "I never knew." She never talked about her achievements. She believed the buildings mattered more than the architect. Clara carefully held the photograph. For the first time, she realized her passion hadn't appeared by accident. She had inherited it. Back in the city, Adrian made an unexpected visit to the community garden. He often stopped there now before work. One morning, he noticed several flowers had withered after an unusually cold night. Without thinking, he began helping volunteers cover the remaining plants to protect them from the frost. An elderly gardener smiled. "First time gardening?" Adrian laughed. "Is it that obvious?" The man nodded. "Plants are a lot like relationships." Adrian looked up. "They don't need expensive things. They just need someone who keeps showing up." The simple sentence stayed with Adrian for the rest of the day. A week later, Ethan gathered everyone at the studio for an important announcement. "Our national award has attracted international attention. Excited conversations filled the room. We've been invited to present our community design model at the Global Urban Innovation Summit in Copenhagen next spring. The office erupted with applause. Ethan looked toward Clara. They specifically requested that you give the keynote presentation. Clara froze. Me? Yes. I've never spoken at an international conference. You'll do great. She smiled nervously. I'll need a lot of practice. You have several months. That evening, Clara walked home through the softly falling snow. Instead of taking a taxi, she chose to enjoy the peaceful silence. As she reached the apartment building, she noticed Adrian sitting alone in the lobby reading a thick architecture book. She looked surprised. I didn't know you were interested in architecture. Adrian closed the book. I wasn't. He smiled awkwardly. I'm trying to understand your world. For a moment, Clara didn't know what to say. She had spent years hoping Adrian would ask about her dreams. Now he finally was. But the feeling inside her had changed. She appreciated the effort, yet she no longer depended on it. They rode the elevator together in comfortable silence. Neither rushed to fill the quiet. When they reached their apartment, Adrian stopped before unlocking the door. I heard about Copenhagen. Clara looked at him. I hope you go. She nodded. I think I will. He smiled sincerely. I think your ideas deserve to be heard. For the first time in many years, Clara believed every word he said. Not because she needed his approval, but because his voice finally carried honesty instead of expectation. That night, as snow continued falling across Silverbrook, Clara stood by the living room window looking at the glowing city below. Only a year earlier, she had believed her future had already been decided. Now opportunities stretched farther than she had ever imagined. And somewhere beyond the frozen skyline, a new chapter of her life was quietly waiting to begin. Spring arrived gently, melting the last traces of winter and filling Silverbrook with fresh colors. Cherry blossoms lined the streets, cafes moved their tables outdoors, and parks once again echoed with the laughter of children. For Clara, the season felt like a new beginning. Every morning she left for work with excitement instead of obligation. Her days were now filled with design meetings, community workshops, and preparations for the Global Urban Innovation Summit in Copenhagen. Although the responsibilities seemed overwhelming, she welcomed every challenge because each one reminded her how far she had come. Inside Ethan's studio, the team gathered around a large digital screen displaying the presentation they would deliver overseas. Architects debated small details, designers adjusted animations, and volunteers organized photographs from their completed community projects. Ethan looked toward Clara. The keynote speech is the only thing left. Clara smiled nervously. I've rewritten it 6 times. He laughed. Good speeches aren't written once. They're discovered little by little. Clara nodded thoughtfully before opening her notebook again. A few days later, Daniel Brooks invited Clara to visit the old railway station renovation project. Construction had finally begun, and what was once a forgotten building was slowly transforming into a vibrant cultural center. Workers restored the original brick walls while local artists painted colorful murals inside. As Clara walked through the building wearing a safety helmet, she noticed dozens of high school students volunteering after classes. One teenager approached her. Ms. Bennett. Yes. I wanted to thank you. Clara smiled. For what? My friends and I used to think we'd leave this town forever. He looked around the construction site. Now we want to stay and help finish this place. Those words reminded Clara that architecture wasn't measured only by buildings completed, but by the hope it inspired. Meanwhile, Adrian continued reshaping Carter Holdings. Instead of focusing solely on luxury developments, he launched a new initiative called Building Together, offering financial support to neighborhood improvement projects throughout the city. Some investors criticized the decision. Others believed it would strengthen the company's public image. But Adrian's motivation had nothing to do with publicity. He had finally realized that success meant little if it never improved anyone else's life. One afternoon, Michael entered Adrian's office carrying several reports. The community initiative is receiving incredible feedback. Adrian smiled. That's good. Michael looked at him carefully. You know, I haven't seen you this relaxed in years. Adrian quietly looked through the office window toward the city skyline. Maybe I finally stopped competing with everyone. Back at the apartment, Clara found something unexpected waiting on the dining table. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't an expensive gift. Instead, It was a small wooden frame containing one of her university sketches. The drawing had been carefully restored and protected behind glass. Beside it lay a handwritten note. I found this inside the old storage box. It deserved to be seen, not hidden away. Adrian. Clara gently picked up the frame. For several moments, she simply stared at it. The sketch showed a small public library surrounded by gardens. She had drawn it nearly 10 years earlier. A quiet smile appeared on her face, not because of the gift itself, but because Adrian had finally understood what truly mattered to her. Several weeks later, the Copenhagen conference drew closer. Architects from more than 30 countries would attend. Although Clara had spoken at many local events, the idea of addressing an international audience still made her nervous. One evening, she visited her grandmother, Eleanor. After dinner, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. "I don't think I'm ready," Clara admitted. Eleanor smiled gently. When your mother gave her first public lecture, she was so nervous she almost canceled. "Really?" "Oh yes." "What happened?" Eleanor laughed softly. She stood in front of the audience and simply spoke from her heart. Clara looked thoughtful. "I don't need perfect words. I just need honest ones." Eleanor nodded proudly. Exactly. Only a few days before the conference, unexpected trouble struck. A severe electrical fire damaged part of the nearly completed learning center. Fortunately, no one was injured, but several rooms suffered heavy damage. News spread quickly. Some reporters questioned whether the project would be delayed for months. Construction workers looked discouraged. Volunteers worried that years of effort might be wasted. When Clara arrived at the site early the next morning, everyone waited for instructions. She quietly examined the damaged building before turning toward the team. "We rebuild." One engineer sighed. "It will take weeks. Then we'll work for weeks. What if the funding runs out? We'll find another way." Her calm confidence spread through the group. Instead of giving up, volunteers immediately returned to work. Within hours, dozens of local residents arrived carrying food, supplies, and tools. Parents brought coffee. Students helped clean debris. Local businesses donated construction materials. The entire neighborhood united once again. Watching everyone work together, Clara realized something incredible. The building was no longer just her project. It belonged to the community. News of the volunteers reached local television. That evening, reporters interviewed residents outside the construction site. One elderly man smiled proudly into the camera. "Buildings can burn, but kindness never does." The interview quickly spread across social media. Donations poured in from across the country. By the end of the week, enough money had been raised to continue construction without delay. Late one evening, after another exhausting day at the site, Clara remained alone inside the partially repaired building. Sunlight faded through the windows as workers gradually headed home. She quietly walked through the empty halls, imagining children filling the rooms with laughter once everything was finished. Behind her, footsteps echoed softly. She turned. Adrian stood near the entrance holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. "I thought you might need this." She accepted one with a grateful smile. "Thank you." For several minutes, they simply looked around the unfinished building. Finally, Adrian spoke. "I used to think leadership meant giving orders." He looked toward the volunteers leaving the site. "You taught me something different." Clara smiled gently. "What did I teach you?" "That real leaders inspire people to care." The words carried no hidden expectations. No attempt to repair the past. Only quiet admiration. Clara looked around the building once more. We're all still learning. As darkness settled over Silverbrook, the lights inside the learning center slowly turned on again. Workers had restored electricity to the undamaged sections of the building. The warm glow spilled through every window, illuminating the neighborhood. Standing outside together, Clara and Adrian watched the building shine against the evening sky. Neither noticed the photographer across the street capturing the moment. The next morning, the photograph appeared on the front page of the local newspaper beneath a simple headline. "Hope always finds a way." Clara looked at the article over breakfast and smiled. The headline wasn't just describing the building. Without realizing it, it had begun describing her life. The morning after the newspaper published the photograph of the glowing learning center, Silverbrook buzzed with excitement. Cafes, office buildings, and train stations were filled with people discussing the remarkable story of a community that had refused to let disaster destroy its dream. Clara's phone was flooded with messages from friends, former classmates, volunteers, and complete strangers. Some congratulated her, while others simply thanked her for reminding them that hope could survive even the most difficult moments. Clara appreciated every message, but she knew the real celebration could wait. The Learning Center was still under construction, and the international conference in Copenhagen was only 10 days away. She placed her phone on silent, grabbed her notebook, and headed to the construction site before sunrise. When she arrived, dozens of volunteers were already there. Some were painting classrooms, while others assembled bookshelves or planted flowers near the entrance. Laughter echoed throughout the building despite the hard work ahead. Daniel Brooks walked over carrying a stack of blueprints. "I've been working on something," he said. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" He unfolded the plans across a large wooden table. "I want to create a nationwide network of community design centers." Clara studied the drawings carefully. Each center would provide free architectural guidance for schools, libraries, parks, and nonprofit organizations. Daniel smiled. "But I don't want to lead it." Clara looked up. "I want you to." She stared at him in disbelief. "Me? You've already inspired people across the country. I've only completed a few projects." Daniel shook his head. "No, you've built trust. And that's much harder than building walls." The idea felt overwhelming. Leading one project had been difficult enough. Leading a national initiative seemed impossible. "I need time to think." Daniel smiled warmly. "Take all the time you need." Across town, Carter Holdings prepared for its annual shareholder conference. Unlike previous years, Adrian decided not to focus his presentation on profits or market expansion. Instead, he introduced a completely new long-term vision. The enormous conference hall became silent as he stood before investors. "For many years," Adrian began, "I believed success was measured only by growth." Large financial charts appeared behind him. I was wrong. He clicked the remote. The screen changed. Instead of graphs, photographs of parks, libraries, and community projects filled the display. "Our company will continue building successful developments." He paused. "But from today forward, every project must leave something valuable behind for the people who live there." Some investors looked surprised. Others nodded thoughtfully. Questions followed. Would community investments reduce profits? Could shareholders support such a strategy? Adrian answered honestly, "I don't believe businesses should choose between success and responsibility." The speech received mixed reactions. Yet when he finished, something inside him felt lighter than it had in years. For once, he had spoken from conviction rather than ambition. Meanwhile, Ethan continued helping Clara prepare for Copenhagen. One afternoon, he interrupted her rehearsal. "You keep changing the presentation." Clara laughed. "I know. You don't trust yourself." She looked down. "I want everything to be perfect." Ethan walked toward the large projection screen and turned it off. "The audience isn't coming to hear perfect words. They're coming to hear your story." "My story?" "Yes. The buildings matter. But people will remember the person who believed they could exist." Clara smiled quietly. For the first time, she stopped memorizing sentences. Instead, she began speaking naturally. Several days later, Eleanor invited Clara to the countryside for lunch before the international trip. After the meal, they walked slowly through the old flower garden. The roses her mother had planted years ago were blooming once again. Eleanor handed Clara a small leather journal. "I've been saving this." Clara carefully opened it. The first page contained her mother's handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a notebook filled with sketches, ideas, and personal reflections about architecture. One sentence immediately caught Clara's attention. "Never design a building hoping people will admire you. Design it hoping strangers will feel welcome." Another page read, "One kind decision can outlive the strongest concrete." Clara gently closed the journal. "I wish I could tell her everything that's happened." Eleanor smiled. "I think she already knows." Back in Silverbrook, the Learning Center officially opened. Hundreds of residents gathered outside the restored building. Children eagerly waited to explore the classrooms. Teachers smiled proudly. Volunteers looked around in disbelief, remembering how abandoned the building had once been. The mayor invited Clara to cut the ribbon. Instead, she handed the scissors to two local children. "They're the reason we built this." The crowd applauded warmly. As the ribbon fell, children rushed inside laughing with excitement. Some immediately filled the reading rooms. Others explored science labs and art studios. Watching their happiness, Clara felt tears quietly fill her eyes. This was worth every sleepless night, every difficult decision, every moment of doubt. Standing quietly near the back of the crowd, Adrian watched everything unfold. He didn't step forward. He didn't ask for attention. He simply watched people thanking Clara. As the ceremony ended, he prepared to leave unnoticed. But Clara called after him. "Adrian." He turned. She walked over with a gentle smile. "You came. I wouldn't have missed it." For a moment, they stood silently watching children playing outside. Finally, Adrian spoke. "I've been thinking a lot lately. So have I. I can't change the past. No. But I can become a better person." Clara looked at him carefully. "I believe you." Those 3 words meant more than forgiveness. They meant she genuinely believed people could change. Yet both of them understood something important. Believing in change wasn't the same as returning to the past. Their future remained uncertain. And strangely, both of them were finally at peace with that. 2 days before leaving for Copenhagen, Clara received one final surprise. An email arrived from the International Association of Community Architects. She opened it without much expectation. Then her eyes widened. The organization had selected her as one of 5 global finalists for the Emerging Humanitarian Designer Award, recognizing architects whose work created meaningful social impact. The award ceremony would take place during the conference. Clara sat silently for several minutes. She remembered the young woman who had once hidden her blueprints inside a dusty cabinet because she believed her dreams no longer mattered. Now those same dreams had carried her onto the international stage. She quietly closed her laptop and looked through the studio window toward the evening skyline. Silverbrook glittered beneath the setting sun. Everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, the long nights, the difficult choices, had led her here. But deep inside, she sensed the greatest chapter of her journey had not yet begun. Beyond the horizon waited a new country, new opportunities, and a future she could never have imagined. And as the airplane ticket rested on her desk beside her mother's old journal, Clara smiled softly. For the first time in many years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready to welcome it. The morning of Clara's departure arrived beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold. The city of Silverbrook was just beginning to wake as taxis moved quietly through the empty streets. Clara stood near the large window of her apartment, holding a warm cup of coffee while watching the sunrise. Beside her suitcase rested 2 items she refused to travel without: her mother's old journal and the small framed sketch Adrian had restored for her months earlier. One reminded her where her dreams had begun, while the other reminded her how far she had come. Before leaving, she took one last walk through the apartment. Every room held memories, some beautiful and others painful. She remembered the countless mornings she had waited for Adrian to wake up, believing that if she loved him enough, everything would eventually become perfect. She also remembered the lonely nights she had quietly cried herself to sleep after another argument, wondering why loving someone had begun to feel so exhausting. But now those memories no longer carried bitterness. They had simply become chapters of a story that had shaped the woman she was today. As Clara picked up her suitcase, Adrian stepped out of the kitchen. "I made breakfast," he said softly. She smiled. "You didn't have to." "I know." For the first time in years, they shared breakfast without awkward silence or hidden tension. They talked about the conference, the weather in Copenhagen, and the new learning center that had become one of the city's most popular places. Neither mentioned their past mistakes. When breakfast ended, Adrian walked her downstairs. Outside, the taxi was already waiting. Before Clara opened the car door, Adrian handed her a small envelope. "Open it after you arrive." She accepted it with a curious smile. "I will." The taxi slowly disappeared into the morning traffic while Adrian remained standing on the sidewalk long after it had vanished from sight. Several hours later, Clara's plane landed in Copenhagen. The city immediately impressed her with its beautiful waterfront, historic streets, and modern sustainable architecture. Everywhere she looked, old buildings blended naturally with innovative new designs. The Global Urban Innovation Summit welcomed architects, engineers, educators, and community leaders from around the world. Walking through the enormous conference hall, Clara heard conversations in dozens of different languages. For a brief moment, she felt nervous. Then she remembered her grandmother's advice. Speak from your heart. That evening, the opening ceremony began. Architects from 30 different countries presented remarkable projects designed to improve lives through thoughtful planning. Clara listened carefully, realizing that although every country faced different challenges, everyone shared the same hope to build a better future. The following morning, it was finally her turn. Standing backstage, she took one deep breath before walking toward the stage. Thousands of people filled the auditorium. Bright lights illuminated the podium. Her presentation appeared on the enormous screen behind her. For several seconds, complete silence filled the room. Then Clara smiled. "When I was a little girl," she began, "I believed buildings were made from concrete and steel." The audience listened attentively. "As I grew older, I discovered they are actually built from something much stronger." She paused. "They are built from trust." Photographs of children reading inside the learning center appeared behind her. Then came images of volunteers rebuilding after the fire. Families planting trees. Neighbors working together. Smiles filled every screen. "I didn't come here to show beautiful architecture. I came here to show what happens when communities believe in each other." By the time her presentation ended, the entire auditorium stood in applause. Many audience members had tears in their eyes, not because the buildings were extraordinary, but because the people inside them were. That evening, the Humanitarian Designer Awards ceremony began. 5 finalists sat quietly as the host described each project. When Clara's work appeared on the large screen, photographs from Silverbrook filled the hall. The community garden, the learning center, the railway station, children laughing, volunteers rebuilding. The host smiled. "This architect reminded us that the greatest designs are those that help people believe in one another." The envelope was opened. The 2027 Emerging Humanitarian Designer Award goes to Clara Bennett. For one breathtaking moment, the entire hall disappeared around her. She slowly walked toward the stage as applause echoed through the auditorium. Holding the award in her hands, she looked toward the audience. "I accept this," she said, "on behalf of every volunteer, every teacher, every child, every neighbor, and every person who believed that kindness is stronger than fear." The applause grew even louder. Back in Silverbrook, residents gathered inside the Community Learning Center to watch the live broadcast. Children cheered. Teachers hugged one another. Daniel proudly wiped away tears. Ethan smiled like an older brother watching a family member succeed. Even Eleanor, sitting quietly in the front row, whispered softly, "Your mother would be so proud." After the conference ended, Clara finally remembered Adrian's envelope. She opened it while sitting beside Copenhagen's peaceful harbor. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Clara, for years I thought success meant reaching the top before everyone else. You taught me that real success is helping others rise with you. I spent too much of our marriage asking you to fit inside my world. I should have spent that time learning about yours. Thank you for every sacrifice you made, even the ones I never noticed. I don't expect another chance. I simply hope that wherever life takes us, you continue becoming the person you were always meant to be. You once believed in me when I didn't deserve it. Now I believe in you. Always. Adrian." Clara quietly folded the letter. A gentle breeze carried across the harbor. She smiled, not because everything had ended perfectly, but because everything had ended honestly. Several weeks later, Clara returned home. Silverbrook welcomed her with celebration, but she asked for only one stop before attending any ceremonies. She visited the old countryside cemetery where her parents rested. Placing the International Award gently beside the flowers, she smiled. "We did it." The wind softly moved through the trees, almost as if answering her. Months passed. The National Community Design Network officially launched under Clara's leadership. New projects began appearing across the country. Abandoned schools became creative centers. Empty parks became lively gathering places. Forgotten neighborhoods slowly came back to life. Thousands of volunteers joined the movement. Young architects discovered a new purpose. Communities once divided learned to work together again. Meanwhile, Adrian successfully transformed Carter Holdings into one of the country's most respected socially responsible companies. The company remained profitable, but it also became known for investing in schools, parks, libraries, and affordable housing. He never claimed credit for the change. Whenever journalists asked what had inspired his new philosophy, he simply smiled and replied, "I met someone who reminded me what really matters." One warm spring afternoon, Nearly 2 years later, Clara visited the very first community garden she had ever designed. The flowers bloomed beautifully. Children played beneath the trees. Elderly neighbors laughed together on the benches. Nothing looked like the abandoned place she had first visited years earlier. As she walked along the familiar path, she noticed a little girl carefully planting a tiny flower beside the walkway. Clara knelt beside her. "What are you planting?" The little girl smiled brightly. "A sunflower." "Why a sunflower?" "Because they always turn toward the light." Clara looked across the peaceful garden. Then she smiled. Maybe people weren't so different. Life could be difficult. Dreams could be forgotten. Hearts could be broken. But as long as someone had the courage to keep looking toward hope, there would always be another sunrise waiting. And with that thought, Clara stood up, continued walking beneath the blooming trees, and stepped confidently into the future she had built. Not with luck, not with wealth, but with kindness, resilience, and the courage to never stop believing in herself.